Sex work has long been a controversial and complex subject. It exists across continents, operating in the shadows of society. However, the harsh realities faced by those involved in the trade often remain unseen by the wider public. In Africa, the phenomenon is particularly. It encompasses a spectrum of exploitation, desperation, and survival. From bustling cities to remote villages, the lives of sex workers reveal a painful tale of economic inequality, societal stigmas, and human vulnerability. Africa's sex trade is both a symptom and a result of systemic failures: poverty, gender inequality, limited economic opportunities, and migration challenges. In countries like Nigeria, Kenya, Sierra Leone, and Libya, women and girls are often pushed into the trade by circumstances far beyond their control. Although some enter willingly, others are coerced, deceived, or trafficked, falling victim to predators and exploitative networks. Poverty is a critical force driving sex work in Africa, with unemployment and economic instability playing significant roles. Sub-Saharan Africa faces some of the world's highest unemployment rates, with women, particularly those in rural areas, bearing the brunt of limited opportunities. When stable jobs and education remain out of reach, survival often leaves no room for choice. In a recent BBC Africa Eye documentary, the story of Isata, a young mother in Sierra Leone, reveals the harrowing life of sex workers in the region. Her life has been a harrowing cycle of violence, exploitation, and survival. Kidnapped and trafficked twice, Isata was forced into sex slavery in multiple countries, including Gambia, Senegal, and Mali, where she endured unimaginable abuse. Initially, Isata turned to sex work to support her young daughter after struggling to find other means of income. However, the dangers of the streets soon became apparent. She faced physical assault, robbery, and constant threats to her life. Despite her determination to care for her child, her circumstances spiraled further. She became addicted to a street drug called Kush, a highly dangerous substance wreaking havoc in Sierra Leone, and declared a national emergency by the government. The stress of her life as a sex worker, compounded by addiction, led her to abandon her 4-month-old son, leaving him in the care of her mother. Isata's plight is not unique. Thousands of women in Sierra Leone, many orphaned by the country's brutal civil war, have turned to sex work as a last resort. Poverty, societal stigma, and the lack of government support push them further into the shadows. Many of these women face violence, contract HIV, or tragically, lose their lives. For others like Isata, trafficking adds another layer of trauma. Lured by promises of legitimate work abroad, they are sold into sexual exploitation and forced to repay exorbitant debts to their traffickers. After being trafficked again in 2024, Isata was forced to work in the gold mining area in Mali under severe conditions. Her traffickers demanded $1,700 to buy her freedom, compelling her to endure further exploitation. However, with the intervention of the International Organization for Migration, she was rescued and returned to her hometown of Makini, where she now lives with her mother and 2 children. This harrowing narrative underscores the systemic failures that leave women vulnerable to such exploitation.
In the small city of Makini, we have hundreds, if not thousands, of sex workers. A lot of them are single mothers like Isata.
Right now, I know who said I go fair money for my able to put me picking school. Persuaded to be travel fair. But for all that sacrifice, I do am for me no my able can for my can please me picking. The cliché I don't receive so many pains than at it. I didn't take my clothes in chair and clothes and put me money in at 200,000. So now they will be really fed. I the first time for my common I do when take the gun. God I can kill me now.
For many women, sex work becomes a means of survival, not a preference. Teenage girls and single mothers are especially vulnerable. Without financial support or access to resources, they often turn to the sex trade to feed their families. Cities like Nairobi, Lagos, Freetown, and Accra have become hotspots for this activity, driven by economic desperation. These urban hubs attract women seeking a way to make ends meet, even as they contend with overcrowded slums, unsafe living conditions, and the constant risk of exploitation. The economic realities in South Africa's mining towns paint a stark picture. These towns, teeming with male laborers, create a high demand for transactional sex. Women from neighboring areas migrate to these locations, hoping to earn money from the influx of miners. For some, this provides a modest income, but for many, it leads to cycles of exploitation, violence, and abuse. The risks often outweigh the financial benefits, trapping women in a dangerous, relentless struggle for survival. The link between poverty and sex work is also evident in rural areas. With limited access to basic education, many young women never get the skills needed to secure formal employment. In some cases, the burden of caring for siblings or extended family forces them into the trade. In others, societal pressures and broken safety nets leave them with no viable alternatives. Tourism also contributes to the industry's expansion. In coastal areas, local and international tourists seek transactional relationships, often exploiting the financial vulnerability of local women. This dynamic perpetuates a cycle where poverty feeds into sex work, and sex work further entrenches the hardships of poverty. For many women across Africa, sex work is not a choice, but a response to an unforgiving economic reality. The absence of job opportunities, paired with systemic poverty, has created a devastating cycle that continues to push vulnerable individuals into the shadows, struggling to survive at the margins of society. Another critical dimension of the sex trade in Africa is migration. Thousands of African women dream of a better life in Europe or other parts of the world. However, the path to their destination is often fraught with danger. Traffickers and smugglers prey on these women, promising them safe passage, but ultimately trapping them in exploitative conditions. Libya serves as a grim example. Located along one of the main migration routes to Europe, the country has become a hotspot for human trafficking. Women hoping to cross the Mediterranean often find themselves stranded in Libya, where they are sold into sex slavery. Held in detention camps or private houses, they are forced to service clients under brutal conditions. The lack of international oversight and Libya's unstable political situation exacerbate the problem, leaving these women with no escape. Reports have highlighted how women are not only trafficked, but also subjected to inhumane treatment, including physical and sexual abuse. The promise of Europe becomes a nightmare, and many are left scarred both physically and emotionally. These women's harsh realities underscore the need for better protection and intervention along migration routes. Sex workers across Africa face intense societal judgment and harsh stigmatization. Often viewed as immoral or dishonorable, they endure rejection from their families and communities. This stigma isolates them, making seeking support or escaping the trade nearly impossible. Many women, even those desperate to leave, feel trapped by the shame and lack of options. In conservative societies, the rejection runs even deeper. Families often disown daughters who engage in sex work, whether by choice or circumstance. This disownment leaves these women without a support system, further driving them into the cycle of exploitation. Without family to lean on, survival often means continuing in a profession that perpetuates their vulnerability. Exploitation is a constant threat. Pimps, traffickers, and other predators profit from the suffering of vulnerable women, controlling their every move. In some cases, sex workers are coerced into handing over most of their earnings, leaving them with just enough to scrape by. Traffickers often use violence or threats to keep them compliant, creating a cycle of fear and dependency that's hard to break. Even law enforcement offers little reprieve. Police officers, instead of providing protection, are sometimes part of the problem. In certain regions, they demand bribes or sexual favors in exchange for leniency, further eroding trust. This corruption leaves women defenseless and emboldens their exploiters. The stigma and exploitation faced by sex workers are deeply interconnected. Stigma keeps them marginalized, while their marginalized status makes them easy targets for abuse. This vicious cycle perpetuates their suffering, ensuring that even those who want to leave the trade have no safe path forward. Breaking this cycle requires more than addressing exploitation. It requires challenging the cultural stigmas that leave sex workers isolated and defenseless. Until these underlying attitudes shift, countless women across Africa will remain trapped in a profession that thrives on their silence and pain. Sex work comes with serious health risks, many of which stem from a lack of access to basic health care. For countless women, especially in Africa, essential services like sexual and reproductive health care are out of reach. This leaves them highly vulnerable to sexually transmitted infections, including HIV/AIDS. In some regions, studies estimate that up to 60% of sex workers are living with HIV. These alarming numbers highlight the urgent need for better health support. Unfortunately, stigma plays a significant role in keeping sex workers away from medical care. Many avoid clinics or hospitals for fear of being judged or discriminated against. The few who do seek help often encounter healthcare providers who are unprepared or unwilling to offer non-judgmental care. This creates an environment where women feel unwelcome, pushing them further into isolation and leaving their health needs unmet. Access to contraceptives and safe abortion services is another critical challenge. Without reliable contraception, many sex workers face the reality of unwanted pregnancies. This often leads to unsafe abortions, which can result in severe complications or even death. For those who carry these pregnancies to term, raising children in conditions of extreme poverty adds another layer of hardship. Tragically, these children are often born into the same cycle of vulnerability, with limited opportunities to escape the hardships their mothers endure. Despite these challenges, there is hope. Community organizations and advocacy groups are working tirelessly to provide support. Outreach programs, mobile clinics, and peer-led initiatives have made strides in bridging the gap between sex workers and healthcare services. These efforts emphasize compassion and respect, creating safe spaces where women can seek help without fear of judgment. Breaking down the stigma surrounding sex work is key to addressing these health risks. When sex workers feel valued and respected, they are more likely to access the care they need. By providing education, resources, and training for healthcare providers, communities can build a more inclusive system that prioritizes health and dignity for all. Trafficking networks play a central role in the African sex trade. These networks operate across borders, luring women with false promises of employment or a better life abroad. Once recruited, the women are stripped of their documents and forced into sex work. Nigeria, for example, has been identified as a major source country for trafficking victims. Many Nigerian women are trafficked to Europe, particularly Italy, where they are forced to work in brothels. The traffickers use threats, violence, and even voodoo rituals to control their victims, ensuring compliance and silence. The involvement of organized crime groups makes it difficult to dismantle these networks. Traffickers use sophisticated methods to evade detection, including bribing officials and using encrypted communication channels. As a result, many women remain trapped with little hope of escape. Governments, NGOs, and international organizations have taken steps to combat the sex trade and protect vulnerable women. Awareness campaigns, rehabilitation programs, and stricter anti-trafficking laws have been implemented in various countries. However, the scale of the problem often outpaces these efforts. Despite these efforts, significant challenges remain. Corruption, lack of funding, and societal attitudes continue to hinder progress. Many programs are unable to reach the most vulnerable women, leaving them exposed to exploitation. For many women trapped in sex work, escaping the trade is almost impossible. Economic hardships, social stigmas, and physical threats from exploiters keep them locked in this vicious cycle. Those who attempt to leave often find themselves with limited alternatives. Without education or skills, opportunities for stable employment are scarce, forcing them back into the very trade they desperately want to escape. Countries like Ghana, Uganda, and Cameroon have reported cases of women trafficked to the Middle East under similar circumstances. While some manage to escape and return home, others remain trapped, unable to pay off debts or secure their freedom. The psychological toll is immense, leaving survivors with trauma and little hope for reintegration into society. Gender inequality plays a critical role in the prevalence of sex work in Africa. In many cultures, women are still seen as secondary to men, with fewer rights and opportunities. This imbalance leaves them disproportionately vulnerable to exploitation. For instance, in patriarchal societies, women are often denied access to education, making it difficult for them to secure decent jobs. Early marriages and teenage pregnancies also limit their prospects, leaving them with few options to provide for themselves and their families. In some cases, women are even forced into sex work by their own families. Driven by extreme poverty, parents or relatives may pressure daughters to engage in transactional sex to support the household. This heartbreaking reality reflects the extent of gendered economic disparities in Africa. Efforts to promote gender equality, such as increasing access to education for girls, are crucial in addressing the root causes of sex work. By empowering women, societies can reduce their vulnerability to exploitation and provide them with the tools to build independent lives. In recent years, technology has significantly changed the landscape of sex work in Africa. Social media platforms and messaging apps have made it easier for sex workers to connect with clients discreetly. While this shift has provided some with a degree of autonomy, it has also introduced new risks. Traffickers often use online platforms to recruit and exploit women. Fake job advertisements and grooming techniques are common tactics used to lure victims. Once recruited, women are often blackmailed with compromising photos or videos to ensure their compliance. Additionally, the anonymity provided by the internet makes it difficult for authorities to track down traffickers or protect vulnerable women. While some countries have begun implementing cybercrime units to address this issue, enforcement remains challenging. On the other hand, technology has also been used as a tool for empowerment. NGOs and advocacy groups have developed mobile apps and online platforms to provide sex workers with access to healthcare, legal support, and safe spaces. These initiatives highlight the potential of technology to bring about positive change when used responsibly. Tourism has played a significant role in the expansion of the sex trade across Africa. In popular destinations like Zanzibar, Cape Town, and Dakar, international visitors often seek illicit services, increasing demand. For many local women, the allure of earning foreign currency becomes a key factor in entering the trade, especially in areas where economic opportunities are scarce. However, this demand has devastating consequences, particularly for young girls. Predatory clients specifically target underage individuals, exploiting their vulnerability. With weak regulations and limited enforcement, these harmful practices often go unchecked, allowing the industry to grow and placing countless lives at risk. Sex tourism creates a cycle of exploitation. While some women and girls are lured in with promises of financial stability, they often end up trapped in abusive or dangerous situations. The power imbalance between clients and local sex workers further exacerbates the issue, leaving women with little to no control over their circumstances. Addressing the impact of tourism on sex work requires stronger laws and consistent enforcement. Governments must prioritize protecting vulnerable populations by holding local and international actors accountable. Efforts should also focus on educating tourists about the harm caused by engaging in exploitative practices and promoting ethical tourism. At the same time, investing in community development and creating sustainable job opportunities can offer women and girls alternatives to the trade. By tackling the root causes of poverty and exploitation, African nations can work toward reducing the prevalence of sex tourism and protecting those most at risk. The children of sex workers face unique challenges. Born into poverty and often without access to proper education or healthcare, they are at high risk of falling into the same cycle of exploitation as their mothers. Programs that provide these children with education, counseling, and social support are essential. By breaking the cycle early, societies can offer them a chance at a better future, free from the shadows of the sex trade. The legal status of sex work varies across Africa, ranging from criminalization to partial decriminalization. In many countries, sex work is illegal, which drives the trade underground and increases the risks faced by those involved. Criminalization often leads to harassment and abuse by law enforcement, as sex workers are treated as criminals rather than victims. This approach does little to address the trade's root causes and perpetuates exploitation cycles. Some countries, like South Africa, have considered decriminalizing sex work as a way to reduce harm and improve access to healthcare and legal protection. Advocates argue that decriminalization could help empower sex workers and reduce their vulnerability to violence and exploitation. However, opponents worry that it could lead to an increase in trafficking and exploitation.
The South African government has introduced a plan to decriminalize commercial sex, hoping to combat the growing violence against women. The legislation presented by the Justice Department suggested that offer and use of sexual services will no longer be treated as a crime. According to associations, the country has about 150,000 commercial sex workers, which is one of the countries with the world's largest HIV epidemic, has been hit by a wave of violence against women.
Effective policies must strike a balance between protecting the rights of sex workers and addressing the systemic issues that drive the trade. Creating comprehensive strategies requires collaboration between governments, NGOs, and community leaders. Sex workers across Africa often face severe human rights violations. Physical violence, sexual assault, and exploitation are common experiences. In some cases, they are even killed, with little to no accountability for the perpetrators. Police brutality is another major issue. Instead of offering protection, law enforcement officers often abuse their power, demanding bribes or exploiting sex workers. This lack of trust in the justice system leaves women vulnerable and perpetuates a culture of impunity. Advocating for the human rights of sex workers is essential to addressing these issues. By recognizing their dignity and humanity, societies can begin to dismantle the systems of abuse and exploitation that keep them in the shadows. Raising awareness about the realities of sex work is a crucial step in addressing the issue. Advocacy campaigns can challenge societal stigmas and promote empathy for those involved in the trade. These campaigns can inspire action and drive systemic change by highlighting their stories and struggles. Education is also key. Teaching communities about the dangers of trafficking and exploitation can help prevent vulnerable individuals from falling victim to these networks. At the same time, empowering women with knowledge and skills can provide them with alternatives to sex work. NGOs, community leaders, and survivors are important in these efforts. Their voices can help shed light on the complexities of the sex trade and push for meaningful solutions. The fight against sex work and exploitation in Africa requires a comprehensive and collaborative approach. Addressing the root causes of poverty, gender inequality, and lack of education must be a priority. Governments, NGOs, and international organizations must work together to create safe and sustainable opportunities for women. Investing in education and economic empowerment programs can help reduce the vulnerability of women and girls. At the same time, stronger laws and enforcement are needed to dismantle trafficking networks and hold perpetrators accountable. By acknowledging the humanity of those involved in the sex trade and addressing their needs with compassion and understanding, societies can begin to bring about lasting change. The journey will be long, but every step brings hope for a brighter future. Thanks for watching. Please leave us a thumbs up and subscribe. We look forward to seeing you in our next video.